UX Podcast is funded by me and Per, together with contributions we get from you, our listeners. If you'd like to contribute, you can do so financially, but also as a volunteer. We'd love your help to make sure we get our transcripts ready and published for each show in good time. So raise your hand and help us by emailing uxpodcast@uxpodcast.com.
UX Podcast episode 222.
I'm James Royal Lawson.
And I'm Per Axbom.
And this is UX Podcast, balancing business, technology and people every other Friday from Stockholm, Sweden, with listeners in 189 countries around the world, from Grenada to Morocco.
Today's guests have been described as designers, strategy consultants, product managers, coaches, authors, speakers, writers, and founders.
And together, they have written the books Lean UX and Sense and Respond, and more recently, they've also founded Sense and Respond Press, with the goal of bringing customer-centric, evidence-based decision-making and agility back into corporate cultures.
Joining us to talk about culture, operations, agility, templates, deliverables, resilience, recipes, and self-sufficient teams, here are Jeff Gothelf and Josh Seiden.
So, Jeff, Josh, Lean UX, it came out back in, 2013, I think, about that time.
First edition came out in March of 2013.
Right. And now, the follow-up book to that, I guess, is that you two did together, is Sense and Respond. But first of all, tell us a little bit about the journey from the Lean UX book to Sense and Respond.
So happy to tell the story. You know, the book has been out now for 6.5 years. We wrote a second edition about 3 years ago, and as the book has been successful, which is amazing, and the work that we've been doing has hinged around the content in the book, and so we've collected feedback over the last 6.5 years about the material and about how well it works and how well it doesn't work in some situations. But if you were to homogenize or boil down that feedback to kind of one core theme, the thing that we hear every single time we get in front of a new client or new class or new workshop or coaching engagement is, we'd love to work this way, but my boss or my company won't let me work this way. We don't work this way. And so Josh and I saw that as an opportunity to have a conversation with the bosses, and that was really the birth of the Sense and Respond idea. And to be a little tongue-in-cheek about it, really the Sense and Respond book and the content that we've been working on for the last few years is the response to the feedback that we sensed from Lean UX.
You know, the specific feedback that we were getting, you know, as Jeff said, people were saying the organization wasn't set up to work this way, or my boss won't let me. And what we realized was that Lean UX was a book that was filled with things that people, individual contributors and teams could do differently to work in a more agile way. But that there were just a lot of things that were out of the team's control. And those things needed to be, that context in which the teams were working, that needed to change. That was an organizational problem, an organizational design problem. And so it was a call to arms for managers to change the organizations, the machine, if you will, that makes the making product possible.
So I love how you learned from the Lean UX book and what you learned from there that turned into the Sense and Respond book, essentially. Now that the Sense and Respond book has been out a couple of years, what have you learned that you wish had been in it, and how are people responding to that, in the sense that, great, now the organization is listening to us, or is there something else we need to still be able to apply the Lean UX processes?
Yeah, so I think the conversations that we're having with leaders who have read Sense and Respond. So our hope was that the people who read Lean UX would give Sense and Respond to their bosses. So that would be the beginning of the conversation. And we have seen that happen. The conversation that we're having with the leaders these days is broader because it's not as simple as saying, okay, well, I'm the VP or I'm the chief product officer, go work in this new, modern, collaborative, customer-centric way. There are a ton of cultural and operational dependencies in an organization to change if you really do want to work this way, not the least of which is things like incentives and performance management criteria and things like that. And so the conversations that we're having are broader. They're conversations about the agility of the entire business and the transformation of the entire organization, which is fascinating and interesting and hairy and complex and difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's organisational change that when it comes to the application of these kind of things, you're not talking about something that happens over a sprint or over kind of a couple of months.
So I mean, yes, it is extremely complex, and I mean, you understand that it is. But how do you bring that down to where do we start? Where's the key to start untangling that mess?
Well, I think one of the things that we realized, and I'll sort of answer your question in maybe two ways. The first is that our goal for Sense and Respond for that book was that it should be a high-level book that was sort of making the case for change and to sort of explain in a kind of a broad directional sense what that change needed to be. A lot of the feedback that we've gotten from that book has been, okay, cool, how do I do it? And the how do I do it problem is a lot more detailed, right? It's a lot more detailed than your first question was like, what do we wish was in that book? You can't fit how do we do it into just, into that kind of book. And so that was in some ways the impetus for, what Jeff and I have been working on next. I sometimes joke that it's the third half of everything I do, which is a new publishing company that we've built called Sense and Respond Press. And we publish kind of short, practical how-to books on exactly this topic, like how do I make those changes? And so the books focus on product management and digital transformation and innovation, and there are a series of like small focused method books that managers can. Our hope was I can read them on a flight from San Francisco to Seattle, or from New York to Boston, or from on the train from London to Paris, and have a method that I can use in some kind of practical, tangible way to start transforming the company.
So that was the outcomes over outputs. That was one of the short books as part of that series.
Exactly. Yeah. So one of the books, the most recent book from the press, we've got 8, Jeff, or 9 books out now. And
eight published.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, 8 published and half a dozen in some form of production.
Yeah. Our first book was actually Jeff's book about the difference or lack of difference between lean and agile and design thinking. But then we've written books on how to run innovation in large companies. And when I say we, Ryan Jacoby, we have fantastic authors. A woman named Debbie Madden, who runs a consulting firm in New York City, wrote a great book called Hire Women. We have a book by Tim Herbig about how product managers need to be what he calls lateral leaders. So I'm not going to list them all. You can go to the website and see them. But so it's not just me and Jeff writing. We've got, in fact, our goal is that it's not us writing, but every once in a while we break down and write a book. So I contributed one to the press called Outcomes Over Output, which again is responding to this question that I'm hearing in my work, which is we love this idea of outcomes. We want to be more outcome focused, but it's difficult. Can you help us? And so that's really a big, that kind of points to what Jeff was saying, which is that, the change is not just do this new thing. It actually, to be more outcome focused, you need to change the way you frame work for your teams, right? Instead of telling them, make me a button, you have to tell them, achieve this result for the business. And so figuring out what that result should be, how to express it to the team, what's the right level of detail, how how to plan and manage and get visibility into that work, how to staff a team that works this way, how to coordinate outcomes across teams. A lot of issues there, and so that's what this book is about.
I actually liked. I think in that particular book, Josh, you tweaked the Agile Manifesto, didn't you? Did you change the first line of that from outputs to outcomes?
Yeah, the nerve of that guy.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, the Agile Manifesto, you're referring to, there's this piece of the Agile Manifesto that says, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer with, I'm going to get the words wrong, but it's like, frequent early delivery of valuable software.
Yeah,
and I think, most of us who work in this business now understand that Agile is applicable to so much more than software, and that we really want to step back and say we want to deliver value early and often to our customers. And how do we do that? And so it's not only about making software. Sometimes it's not about making software at all. It's about achieving this result. And so how do we broaden our focus to encompass to focus on delivering value, not just making a piece of running code?
For me, I love how the publishing company is an example of a design solution intended to solve the problem of you give a book to a manager, but they don't have time to read it. But they have specific questions. You can hand them one of these books. They'll sort of have time to read that, and then they'll realize, oh, I need to read more of those books. You're sort of tricking them into reading a full book by reading it in pieces, and then essentially you're getting your message across by just giving it to them in those small chunks.
Yeah, and look, that is not coincidental. That was born of research. So our background is UX. We're UX designers, right? And the style of work that we advocate is customer centric, right? So if we're going to build a new product or service for a specific target audience, let's go understand how to better serve that audience. And we went out and we created personas, target personas of who we thought we were building this press for, and then we went and we talked to those folks, and we ran the research to understand whether our assumptions were right. And some of our assumptions were correct, and some of them were not as correct, and that helped us really form a better presentation and a better hypothesis for this content that we began to publish. But one of the things specifically that we learned was, and it really came from, we had a prototype. The prototype was the first version of Lean versus Agile versus Design Thinking, which I had self-published just on my own as an experiment. And every time we put that size of a book into the hands of somebody who matched our persona, the first thing they would say would be something like, I might actually read this. And to us, that was validating, and it was the length that they were speaking about. They said, look, this is 30, 40, 50 pages. Like Josh said, I can get through this on a flight or a commute or a train ride. And that's far more realistic than a 250 or 300 page book. And so everything that we've done here has been research driven, has been experiment driven, and most importantly, it's been customer centric because, we live the ideas that we teach.
So if the book is too long for managers to read, and you say that you can't fit in all the answers of how you do sense and respond, how you actually put that into practice, we've now got a podcast, which our interview is going to be like 25 minutes or so. How do we then boil down sense and respond into an answer to a question on a podcast?
Josh?
Well, it's simple, guys. You just follow this recipe.
Right.
I think one of the challenges is that organizations really want recipes because recipes give you the sort of they let you dictate everybody's moves from a kind of a central kind of command and control position. And as we try and increase agility, we're trying to move away from command and control into more of an aligned organization where leadership is setting direction, and the folks in the rest of the organization who are closer to the work are sort of learning their way forward and letting solutions emerge. And that's really hard, and it's really counter to all of the instincts of leadership, and it's counter to the structures that we set up. I mean, starting with fundamental things like annual planning and budgeting, like how do you know it's August 2019, we're going to come into the sort of annual planning season in Q4 now. How in the world am I going to know in October 2019 what I should be building in October 2020? And so we talk about kind of a principles-based approach in Sense and Respond, which are things like embrace continuous change. Just to kind of sit on that one principle for a second, that's the one that says, look, you won't actually know in October 2020 what you should be building. So you need to build resilient systems that are capable of sensing and sensing and responding. And then in your organization, what does that actually mean? Because we can't come in here and anticipate all of the problems we're going to run into as we start to change. So, for example, you might be a consulting company. I worked with a consulting company recently that wants to work this way, but they write contracts in such a way that they promise their clients a specific set of deliverables, right? In other words, we're going to make this stuff for you. And you really can't be agile when you're promising a specific set of deliverables. So what do you do about that? Right? How do you start to change your contracting process? I can't tell you. All I know is that contract is setting a constraint that's limiting your agility. And so when I work with teams, and when Jeff and I do this together, it's about understanding like what are the things that are limiting our agility, and how do we design experiments and interventions to start removing those things and replacing them with new structures that might increase our agility.
I think it's a great example of the contracting side of things, because that, an agency or when you're agreeing to deliver something, there's two parties to a contract. It's you and the customer. So the customer must have requested or agreed to that delivery. So there you've got that opportunity for a dialogue, for a shared understanding of what you're trying to achieve.
Exactly. They're in the same position where they're trying to manage their uncertainty, right? We're not sure if this vendor is going to be any good. And so we're going to manage our uncertainty about the quality of this vendor. And by specifying in great deal in a kind of old school command and control way, here's exactly what you're going to do. There's other contractual arrangements. There's time and materials, fee for service, right? The way we hire doctors and lawyers. We can do that. We're just not used to setting those kinds of commercial terms when we're purchasing software or design.
I like how there's like a catch-22 here, because we're saying, of course, there is no recipe. But what people are looking for when they read a book is, we want the recipe. So it's a recipe for not following the recipe. You have to keep an open mind. You have to be open to the uncertainty. You're always going to be surprised. I realize you guys do a lot of teaching and workshops and stuff as well. How do you help people get over that need or want to plan everything and get them to be more like open-minded and listening to everything that's going on and sort of sensing and responding to that instead of their plan that they thought they had?
Look, we like to poop on recipes. To be honest, right? Recipes are fine as starting points, right? So if you ever look at you read any certainly stuff that I've written and some interviews that I've done about SAFe, the scaled agile framework, you won't hear me say too many nice things about it. But as a starting point, a recipe is fine. So if your organization is going to apply the scaled agile framework as a starting point, not as the destination, then fine, right? You don't know where to start. You want some kind of a step-by-step process to get you started. Great. There's Scrum. There's design thinking. There's Lean Startup in the enterprise. There's Lean UX. There's SAFe. There's whatever, a Kanban, right? There are all these things. Use them as a recipe for a place to start. But then truly embrace the continuous improvement, continuous learning, and the kind of inspect and adapt mantra of Scrum and Agile and so forth, and periodically retrospect. We've been doing this recipe now for a month. What's working? Well, these 5 things are working really well. Great. Let's keep doing them. What's not working? Well, it's really difficult for us to do these other 3 things. Okay, let's do them differently, and let's try that for a month, right? So as long as people use the recipes as a place to start and then evolve them to fit the unique needs, contexts, corporate politics, industry regulations and constraints, etc., of their business, that's perfectly okay, right? That's how organizations become more mature in process. The problems come when people apply those recipes wholesale as the destination, and anybody who steps outside their little box in a diagram gets chastised, or worse, perhaps, right? That's not Agile, that's not safe, that's not Scrum, that's not Kanban, whatever it is, right? I think that's where we get into trouble with these recipes. And so starting points, yes. Destinations, no.
I think that's an excellent way of putting it. It makes me think of, because I work a lot with accessibility, you have the World Content Accessibility Guidelines, and people follow that. That's a perfect recipe. But that's not what makes websites accessible. What makes websites accessible is, of course, being able to listen to people with disabilities, including them in the work. So there's a starting point to get an understanding of the problems we're facing, but then you have to actually do the real work of talking to people again. So yeah, completely agree.
There was something I picked up on in the respond part of Sense and Respond about you suggest that self-sufficient teams are part of a good way of working, and that intrigued me. I like the idea of that. Can you say a little bit more about how does a self-sufficient team work?
Well, so the idea of a self-sufficient team is, we talk a lot about, in Lean UX, we talk about small, cross-functional, co-located, self-sufficient teams. And that means that it's a team that has all of the capabilities they need to plan, design, create, and deliver their work. And in other words, they don't have dependencies on other parts of the organization. They can make a thing, they can ship it. If it works, great, it lives. If it doesn't work, they can pull it back. The sort of fundamental notion here is that dependencies reduce agility. Right? So you want to create these teams that have, ideally, dependencies on external people. It's hard to do. It may be actually impossible, but that's kind of the goal. And so to do that, you need to kind of it starts to break down some of the silos in the organization. You have to move the engineers and the designers and the testers and the product people. They actually have to sit together, which sounds simple, but in big organizations, moving desks can be difficult, right? You have to figure out in regulated environments, how are people going to ship when we've got this policy that everything gets 3 levels of oversight and review from legal and compliance and blah blah blah, right? What can we do to limit or minimize or eliminate that dependency? So it's like depends on the organization. It's challenging, but the goal there is to have a team that can just act without intermediaries and act quickly.
Yeah, no, I like when you're saying it's not a dogma. You don't have to be completely self-sufficient, but if you're striving to become more self-sufficient, then you will operate better.
Yeah, and I think with all of this stuff, we were just talking about recipes, and recipes, to Jeff's point, that they're good starting points. They're the way that we kind of encode and hand off expertise. If you don't know how to make clam chowder, right? Here's a piece of paper. This is going to tell you how experts have figured out how to make clam chowder, right? Now go make it your own. And I think what we miss sometimes in that are the principles behind the recipe. And so self-sufficient teams, that's a recipe. What's the idea? What's the reason? And the reason is that cross-functional collaborative teams are better because they have more points of view. They create better solutions because they bring all these different points of view together. And they're faster because they're not limited by dependencies. So they're, again, dependencies limit Agile. And so when you start going back to like the reasons behind these recipes, that's when you can really start to make them your own in the organization.
Yeah. So now I'm thinking about baking now, of course. Well, I do.
James bakes a lot.
I do a fair bit of baking, and that's exactly the same thing with the recipes. That you look around for the chowder or some recipe for a cake, and you think, oh, this sounds excellent, and then you start doing it, and you think, no, this is not. No, I need to do this instead. Or I'm going to try doing that, or this will suit my taste or my family's tastes better. Because that's the thing. We're a bunch of individuals, just like organisations, I guess, are individual. That's one person can like lager, another person likes stout or porter or something. Very different taste.
Yeah, and if you think about that analogy, James, like, if you do a lot of baking, you're at a point where you can look at a recipe and kind of very quickly say, well, because I have a lot of experience here, I know how to bring myself into this recipe, and I'm going to change this or I'm going to change that. And but somebody who's new to baking wouldn't have that sort of all of that tacit knowledge that you've built up over your years of baking. And so is going to be more inclined to just stick to whatever the recipe said, and wouldn't even know if this happened. This happens all the time, right? There's a typo in the recipe, and it says this crazy amount of salt versus a normal amount of salt, and you go like, okay, well the recipe says put in a cup of salt. Instead of a teaspoon of salt, and this thing tastes awful. So being able to bring that tacit knowledge, I would say that's another thing and maybe that's Jeff, you can comment on this, but I think it's one of the reasons why coaches are so valuable in transformations. Agile coaches get a lot of grief online, but these are people who've done this before and can see the trouble in the recipe and can also help you learn the principles behind these recipes.
The good ones. And so this is the thing, right? And so I've worked or been, or have collaborated with or have worked with organizations who use Agile coaches. And I find that the good ones who have seen the recipes evolve into useful methodologies inside organizations definitely want to have this conversation. But I've also met Agile coaches who are very staunch defenders of the recipe. And when you and I both take a very non-traditional, sort of non-purist view of the Agile processes and methodologies, and when you present a challenge to the recipe, there often comes up a big defense. Well, that's not Agile, right? Or that's not Scrum, or that's not how we do it, right? So I think that the more enlightened Agile coaches definitely get it, but I've definitely come across those that don't.
Yeah, I mean, there's just such a huge amount of common sense to all this, isn't there? Really, like going back to the baking analogy. I mean, sometimes I bake stuff that I like, and I suspect no one else in my family will like, but I'll bake it anyway, and I end up with a huge pile of cookies or biscuits or something that I'm going to have to munch through over a few days because they're not interested. But okay, maybe next time I won't.
Poor James.
Exactly, pity me. But then next time I won't do that one. I'll change it. I'll tweak it another way because now I've confirmed that they don't like it, and I already knew they probably wouldn't like it.
Oh, this is interesting because I actually have a question I want to ask because it's something that I come across a lot because I work in a lot of big projects in healthcare. You guys are saying that we need to put something in the market, but assume it will be wrong.
Yeah.
So we put something out, but there's never, ever any budget for something being wrong because that's when the project's end and maintenance takes over perhaps, but there's not like, how do we help people understand the importance of we will learn so much. That's our. I mean, it's a fantastic opportunity to perfect the product after we actually put it out there.
So Jeff and I ran a consulting firm for a few years together, and clients would come to us, clients who were not in the software business. They would come to us and they would say, you know, we need an app, or we need you to build a thing for us. And I would say to them, you know, you think you're buying a packaged solution that you can just kind of have, but you need to think about this as like you're getting a puppy. You know, and you're going to be taking care of this puppy for the next 15 years, you know? And so are you really prepared to take ownership of this solution that you're buying? Because it's not a project in the traditional sense of like, we build a building and then we have a building and we can dismiss the construction crew. It's a product is a different way of thinking and organizing work, and it's an ongoing commitment. You don't ship it one and done. And so really moving this is one of the changes that we talk about. That is one of the kinds of changes we talk about in Sense and Respond, which is that you embracing continuous change means it's not one and done. It's your first release is the first of many.
Exactly. I feel like we have a couple of new books for you to be writing on, or engaging someone to write now. Agile coaches and how to launch and learn after launch and stuff like that. Because I mean, I would definitely want to read those. And there are so many good things to say about it.
Well, I will tell you that we've got books coming on one of those. Too early to talk more specifically about that.
A cliffhanger.
Yeah. This was awesome. Thank you for talking to us. And I hope we'll actually be able to talk about some more of your upcoming books soon again.
All right. Terrific. Well, listen, thank you both for having us. It's always a pleasure to connect.
Yes. Thanks very much. This was great.
So I really liked the analogy with baking because it was so easy for me to visualize how you experiment when you're baking, and even when you're cooking, of course, with recipes. Once you've confidently made them X number of times, and you know that these are the things that go into it, then you feel confident enough to start experimenting, and that's how you build knowledge and experience.
Yeah, you make mistakes when baking and cooking. You do experiment when doing stuff. Like I said, you maybe throw in a different ingredient or more of a certain ingredient to see what happens. But I think another thing that's fascinating is that you build up like a realm of knowledge within baking that, you know, some of it's quite inherent. That's quite obvious, you'd say. There are certain things you don't do. Like if I'm thinking about what do I do with these cookies this time, I don't grab the nails and throw in a bunch of tacks or whatever into my baking. You know, I'm not going to like break a bottle and throw a glass in. I understand that there are certain experiments, certain limitations to what I should do as part of my experimentation, or these things I don't need to learn, I guess, because maybe I picked up as a child, or I don't know, picked up earlier in my career. But yeah, it's a very, very interesting analogy to use the baking one. I think for very much about how we.
Yeah, if you continue on that, I mean, if I tell you to make chocolate muffins, then that's probably not enough information, or maybe it is, and I say I want them with nuts, and then you start having to ask me, so who are these muffins for? And that's when we start getting into what I really liked, what Josh was saying about people specify deliverables when they're doing proposals. So they're specifying, this is what we're going to give you. We're going to give you chocolate muffins with nuts and this and this and this. But along the way, as you're talking to the people who you're making the muffins for, you may realize you have to change that. And all of a sudden, the deliverables that you've written inside the proposal is wrong.
Yeah, exactly. That you're going to end up shipping an experiment with nuts in that could potentially cause allergic reactions to all the people that are eating them.
Yeah,
maybe.
Exactly. Yeah.
I like that.
Because the client thought that everybody wanted nuts.
Or rather, maybe the client didn't realize that nuts could be a problem.
Yeah. Right, exactly.
There was
they were not.
the
they were
knowledge
just
wasn't there. Yeah,
oblivious to it.
exactly.
Yeah.
Oblivious to it. The knowledge wasn't there. So yeah, it's embracing continuous change. Absolutely, and shipping experiments and shipping things quickly because it's just you're never going to be finished. Excellent, but we've still got to build up that knowledge and keep hold of the knowledge and make sure we don't cause too much harm.
Yeah, and how do you recognize the knowledge if you're someone buying these services? It's really hard. I mean, usually people just go, look at that. The deliverables look the same in both proposals. One price is lower than the other. I'm going to go with the lower price. But within the higher price of the other proposal, there might be so much experience in realizing that we're going to be changing this along the way as we learn more.
But even if you don't look at the kind of buying in this from an external vendor and you look at in-house, how do you do it in-house? How do you kind of bake your cakes without glass in or nuts in?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for this. This is hard.
Yeah.
This adaptation of knowing that we have to change along the way, I think this is one of the most difficult things for us to both do, but also actually convince the rest of the organization on. Because if people are used to us, so the UX people come in, they're the ones who do the customer journey maps. But at one point or another, we're going to realize, well, in this case, the best thing is not for us to do the customer journey map. And then someone's going to say, so why do we need you? You need me because I was the one who realized that's not what we need right now. We need to go out and talk to people and do user interviews first before even trying to do that customer journey map.
Yeah.
But that how our industry and actually how our profession does different things in different scenarios, I think that's what other people have trouble with understanding. How am I supposed to hire you if I don't know what you're going to be delivering? I think that's why we argue so much about what we do.
Yeah, I wonder if this is related to why we've seen such a growth in in-house teams.
Mm-hmm.
That with in-house teams, you've internalized that issue or question that you've already reached.
Right, you don't have to ask for it because the team will take care
of it. Yeah, well, you've reached that point of maturity where you've understood that this is an important part of your basic recipe, that designers or UX needs to be involved. So you bring that resource in house, and then you're trusting it to make these decisions, and it's as it's a continuous improvement and an ongoing commitment. The fact that you've bought into the idea of these resources being needed means that you don't necessarily maybe need to worry about exactly what they're delivering, maybe.
Interesting.
But now I'm being very kind of like high level about what UX resource is. I mean, I know that there's people who are hired to produce, prototypes or kind of like sit there creating something maybe in, XD or Figma or something. I mean, that is what you do as part of a scaled process.
Exactly. I'm not sure we've answered any questions here, but you're problematizing things that we need to be thinking about all the time, how we communicate these issues and how we take care of them.
But it's fine, Per, because I suppose in some way our outro today is rather than us kind of come with concrete advice, we're giving people the ingredients to maybe work on their own recipe.
Exactly. We are sensing, and the listeners now have to respond.
Or keep on researching, keep on digging. We don't have all the answers, Per.
Damn it. Which is why we do have an answer in the form of a recommended listening after this episode, which would be episode 75, Principles of Agility with Dave Gray, which will bring you even more questions.
Thanks for listening. Always a pleasure. A quick reminder, you can contribute to Funding UX Podcast by visiting uxpodcast.com/support. Or you can send us an email and volunteer to help with our transcripts.
Remember to keep moving.
See you on the other side.
James, did you hear about the guy who stole the calendar?
No, Per, I didn't hear about the guy who stole a calendar.
He got 12 months.
Oh, God.